The world's busiest maternity ward, bursting with life. Even in the middle of a crippling pandemic. Across the city, a crematorium, unused, until COVID-19 struck. For every life that disappears into ashes, though, a family lost in grief. Hello and welcome to this edition of Assignment Asia. I'm Barnaby. The coronavirus pandemic has disrupted almost every aspect of our lives. Two things do remain constant. Babies are still being born, people are still dying. But what does it mean to welcome new life and grieve the loss of loved ones in this time of fear and uncertainty? Here in the Philippines, where lockdowns have lasted months, navigating restrictions alone can prove challenging. When we met Ronel Manjares in his parents' home in the province, he was in a daze. He needed to get away from Metro Manila, where he worked and lived, and where he and his family went through one of the toughest times in their lives. His second child, Kobe, was born in April, in their home in the city, in the middle of a coronavirus lockdown.
So, nung unang araw po walang problema kasi okay naman po. Hanggang sa umabot yung nung pang-apat na araw ko, naangamba na ako kasi hindi pa po siya nakakalumi yung bata. Pero pagka 5 days po niya, hindi pa rin siya kaya po dila ko na siya sa ospital.
Nahirapan din ba kayo doon yung pagpapa-admit sa kanya sa ospital?
Nahirapan din. Wala ko kami masyadong masakyan, hindi makakalabas. Paano po sa kung saan maidadala yung bata. Naghahanap po ng ang ospital. Kaya mahirap talaga. Wala. Halos po mga 2 araw, hindi pa rin ako makatulog noon.
Bakit daw po ayaw tanggapin si Baby Kobe?
Kasi po, baka daw mawaan pa ng virus doon. Kaya hindi sila tumatanggap.
With hospitals in their area not able to admit Kobe, Ronel had to consider traveling beyond. But that meant finding a vehicle to borrow first. That alone took hours. Then they had to drive all the way to the other side of town, to a hospital that neighbors had said might be able to treat Kobe.
Ano pong sabi sa inyo ng mga doktor nung unang pagdating niyo doon?
Kasi sabi nung nag-admit, huwag daw po muna palisin yung sasakyan, baka hindi daw nila tanggapin yun. Nakiusap na lang din ako.
Then came the worst possible news.
Pinasok ko sa IC, tapos sinwab test po, tsaka pinasok na ako sa loob, COVID ward.
Bakit daw po sinwab test?
Kasi daw yung bata may lagnat. Nilagnat daw.
So Kobe Manjares was only a few days old when he was brought to this hospital, the National Children's Hospital. Doctors here say He wasn't exhibiting respiratory symptoms at that time, but he was exhibiting other COVID symptoms, and that's why he was admitted here to the COVID ward of the hospital.
The result came back positive, but Ronel and his wife turned out to be negative of COVID-19. It was baffling.
Siguro po sa namin yung sa pagbiyahe-biyahe ho. O baka doon sa mga napuntahan kong mga may ospital na may mga kaso din pong
Well, baby Kobe was brought in at NCA.
Kobe's attending physician, Dr. Sherwin Leonardo, says he could have gotten it anywhere.
That time, we really could not tell where Kobe contracted the disease. So, because he was exposed to a lot of people.
Whatever the source of the infection was, a newborn infant who may be sick with the coronavirus was no small matter.
Infants less than 1 year of age had the highest risk of hospitalization according to reports. No? So they are at a high risk also for developing severe disease. And this is maybe due to their immature immune system, which make them vulnerable to contracting serious viral infections.
But Kobe was a fighter. At just half a month old, he survived COVID-19, becoming the youngest Filipino at the time to recover from the deadly new disease. The entire hospital celebrated with his family.
Tuwan na rin ho dun sa amin. Sigawan niya yung mga tao dun sa amin, tuwan-tuwa mga tao sa amin. Palabas na.
A few days later, though, they were back in the hospital for an infection unrelated to COVID-19. This time around, Kobe didn't make it.
Bago mawala. Kausap ko din ho yung doktor noon. Nung gabi na yun kasi tumawag yung asawa ko. At tatanungin niya ako kami kung tutubuhan ng bata noon. Tapos po, nagsabi na lang yung doktor, Sir, wait lang po kasi yung anak niyo nag-0-0 na.
Ronel says even taking Kobe's remains back home proved a challenge. It was misery to the end. For months, half of the country was at a standstill. Some of the world's toughest quarantine measures meant public transport, among others, was paralyzed. Even after the government slowly eased restrictions. It's why Marianne Reyes hasn't visited her gynecologist for half her pregnancy. She was 8 months pregnant when we met her.
Yung check-up ko sa pagbubuntis, sa clinic lang ako, dito malapit lang din.
But more than the limited movement, there's fear of contracting coronavirus.
Inaalala ko din kasi yung nasa balita na yung baby bagong panganak na nag-positive agad. Yun ang inaalala ko na sana wag naman.
It is a fear that Marianne and her husband, Cosmos, lived through on a daily basis. As a police officer manning checkpoints, Cosmos is considered a frontliner and is relatively more at risk of getting infected with COVID-19.
Ayun, may kasama kami namatay sa COVID. Namatay, may kasama kami. Tapos may kasama naman kami namatay sa checkpoint. Di ba parang double risk ng buhay ng pulis ngayon.
So anong feeling mo, Marian, pagka every time pumapasok siya sa trabaho?
Minsan nag-aalala na baka pag-uwi niya may COVID na. Ganun. Hindi lang ang pinaka-inaalala kong mahawa sa amin yung may sakit kong anak kasi madali siyang mahawa.
Madali siyang mahawaan.
Kahit simpleng ubo at sipon lang, madali siyang mahawa.
Their third child, Alexis, has leukemia. Like Marie-Anne, Alexis isn't able to go to the hospital for his regular treatments. To keep everyone healthy, sacrifices have to be made.
Ang ginagawa ko lang talaga sa pang-araw-araw ko na duty, sa pag-uwi ko, mga anak ko, hindi ko na nalalapitan yan. Pagyakap, paghalik, hindi ko na nahalikan yan.
Hirap.
Kaya yun yan, yung mga uniform ko, halos nasira na isang uniform ko, kakalaba. Diba? Kasi yung effort mo sa trabaho, pag uwi mo ng bahay, halos pagod ka na, puyat ka pa. Pero kailangan mong kailangan mong mag-ingat pa rin. Kaya ang kalaban namin, ang dami.
Their biggest decision of all, however, was to forgo their plan for Marie-Anne to give birth in a hospital and do it instead in a private maternity clinic. In addition to usual procedures, Marie-Anne is required to undergo a COVID-19 test at their own cost.
Gusto talaga namin mga anak sa ospital. Dahil nga sa pandemic, parang natatakot din kami na maano siya sa ospital kasi 'di ba mostly ang ospital ngayon contaminated na rin ng COVID.
Mas safe pagka sa hospital kasi nandoon na yung mga doktor. Sa clinic kasi minsan lang yung doktor, ang kasama mo lang doon midwife.
Kung sa ospital kasi pwede ko magamit yung lalo na sa krami, libre siya sa krami kung tutusin .
Yung swab test na yan, kayo gagastos niyan?
Oo, kasi kasama sa atin ng ospital . Actually, nagpa-compute na nga kami sa Nagpa-compute na kami dito sa lying in. Medyo mataas din.
It's going to set them back at least $600 US, but safety first, they say. To the extent that Cosmos is moving out temporarily as soon as their new baby is home.
Sabi ko, pagka nanganak sila, magse-separate na muna ako. Doon muna ako sa nanay ko.
Naku, sacrifice?
Kasi hindi ko masabi, palayo ng lugar. Baka mamaya bigla ako nag-positive sa COVID. Kawawa, 3 nang alalahanin ko. Ito, yung baby, saka to.
As a cop who's risked his life in the name of duty, Cosmos understands the threat of death more than most people. But losing a loved one to COVID-19 is a different story. Perhaps one only those who felt it can tell. Midway through the year 2020, as the government resumed economic activity, the Philippines' coronavirus cases surged by the thousands. In Metro Manila in particular, hospitals warned of full capacity for critical care of COVID-19 one after another. Dr. Norberto Francisco is a pulmonologist at the Lung Center of the Philippines.
Which is inevitable. When
we met in early July, he told me they still had the capacity to admit COVID-19 patients, but it was getting smaller, quick.
Now we're doing real time.
So these are all critical cases?
These are all critical cases because we converted this whole wing into an ICU wing, and each and every bed is capable of handling ICU cases.
By the end of July, however, their emergency wing was overflowing. As a hospital that specializes in respiratory diseases, it isn't unusual for the Lung Center to be admitting severe COVID-19 cases. But it's alarming when even the emergency ward turns into an intensive care unit. Dr. Francisco had hoped not to relive the first days of the outbreak.
How bad was the death rate back then?
The extubation rate or the success rate of those hooked to a ventilator was around 4%. Now it's gone up to around 23%.
4%.
Only 4%
So only
would
4%
survive.
survive?
Yes,
Oh my.
yes.
Wow.
It was very devastating. Some survivors have told me that the most difficult part are not the symptoms, the pain they are feeling or the shortness of breath, but the loneliness. Staying alone for 7, 14 days or even longer if they have complicated cases, and especially if critical, the thought of dying alone. That's most difficult for them.
At one point, patients were dying before their COVID-19 tests could yield results. Dr. Francisco says they diagnosed clinically instead to make sure infectious remains, whether confirmed or suspected, don't spread the virus.
So you could tell without the confirmatory test that a person has been infected or has died of COVID.
More or less, more of more, because
More of more.
more of more,
Yeah.
because they would present with a rapidly deteriorating conditions, with a very, very high demand for oxygen. And we see a considerable number of patients who will also go into kidney failure, not only lung failure.
Tell me about the process of managing the dead. That did change, right, with the advent of COVID.
Yes,
Yeah?
yes.
How?
So especially if it's a confirmed case, they will have to be in a body bags. Not just 1, 2 or 3 layers, because we have to make sure that their body fluids and everything is sealed. Once we have a body in the mortuary, in less than 4 hours, they're out.
Filipinos have wakes that last days. And funeral processions complete with a marching band. But COVID-19 gives mourning families none of those. Victims must be cremated within hours, or at most a few days after dying. There was a rush to finish building public crematoriums.
For years, the construction of a crematorium in this community cemetery had sat idle, but the coronavirus pandemic necessitated public crematoriums. And so every day since March, they've been burning several bodies here each day.
And while it's painful to lose a loved one for any reason, COVID-19 adds layers of loneliness and longingness. Nadi Atangan Jr. never had a chance to see his youngest children, twins who were born preterm and who tested positive for the new coronavirus after they had already passed away.
Gising po namin, parang wala na siyang pakiramdam sa bibi, hindi na gumagalaw. So yun lang ang expect ko, yung bibi lang. Pero nung time na yon, nung kakalabas lang ng anak ko, sabay tumawag po sa akin yung doktor na positive siya sa COVID-19.
So paano kaya nagka-COVID mga baby?
Ang sabi kasi sa akin ng doktor, yung baby daw, kasi nga yung misis ko nasa COVID ward siya. Na-expose na daw yung baby dun sa COVID. Dinala po sa laboratory para i-autopsy. Tapos tawag sa akin ng doktor. Yun nga, nag-positive din po sila sa COVID. So, ang naisip ko, patay na nga yung baby ko, nag-positive pa. Parang ang hirap tanggapin. Masakit. Nakakalungkot. Kasi dyan na po
Sige, okay lang.
Nakakalungkot po talaga. Kasi anak mo na kumbaga buo na.
The only time he was able to hold them was in a box.
Ngayon po kasi wala talaga akong gawa kundi sundin po ang protocol sa tinatawag na COVID. Kasi po bawal din talaga na kumalat pa yung ganitong sitwasyon na pandemya na to. So isang para sa akin po tatanggapin ko na lang po na ganun. Kahit masakit. Yun, maiuwi ko po sila pero abo na.
On top of his grief, Nadi fears he and his 4 other children may also be at risk of contracting the coronavirus disease. He's asked community leaders for help to get tested, but the response has been slow.
Ang kasing sabi po kasi sa akin ng doktor, makipag-coordinate ako sa barangay, yun nga. Makipag-coordinate na ako para din matest po kami. Pero nalipas na po yung isang linggo, mag-iisang linggo na po, wala pong nangyaring test.
The coronavirus disease has proven to be extremely contagious. So much so that it leaves even those heavy with the loss of loved ones with no choice but to be on their toes. Everyone's vulnerable, most especially those who come into close contact with confirmed patients. Bebeth Orteza's brother, Neil Orteza, knew this. After all, he was a doctor, a frontliner in the battle against COVID-19.
On March 19, he sent me this text. My chest CT scan was read as COVID pneumonia. So I said, can I visit you? He said, no, you can't visit me because I'm diabetic, I have asthma, I am hypertensive, I have cancer issues. You could say I'm the woman who has everything. Okay. So he didn't want me to visit him in the hospital.
That was a hard pill to swallow. Growing up, they were close. But it had been months then since they last saw each other.
Last time I saw him was November 26th of last year. And then we spent the holidays abroad, my family and I. And then we were always keeping it, making plans, let's have coffee, let's have coffee. We never got to. Until I got the text message from him about he's having COVID.
There had been signs Neil would survive.
From my understanding, the lung part of his infection, because he was intubated, no? He was on a ventilator, that was getting better.
But Neil was in his 60s and had diabetes. He ultimately succumbed.
Last stage, just as we thought he was getting better, he developed disseminated intravenous coagulation. He had blood clots all over his body, and they were bursting.
And that was it. Bebeth never saw her brother again.
It was hard because I was begging. I was begging for them to allow me to go to the cremation. They wouldn't let me. They wouldn't let me because they said it wasn't going to be healthy for me. And to this day, that's what pains me. I tell myself, was it just a rumor that he passed? Did he really go? You know, when I look at charts that say, let's say, 1,206 died, I read that as 1,205. I always automatically take one digit out from the list of those confirmed dead because I'm still pretending that my brother is here.
Because you didn't see him go.
Because I didn't see him go. The pain comes from the lack of closure. Not being there to give your loved one a final kiss.
Dying alone and grieving apart. Cold new realities of the coronavirus pandemic. But at the same time, it's a sobering reminder that human existence is precarious and that we are all living on borrowed time in this world.
COVID-19 isn't the first deadly virus to sweep the world. The 20th century Spanish flu killed more than 40 million people in a year. Thanks to modern medicine, the coronavirus isn't likely to kill that many people within such a short period of time. But no one knows when the pandemic of our generation will end. Till then, the threat of the disease will always come with the specter of death. For Simon Asia, I'm Barnaby Lowe. Share your thoughts and contribute story ideas to our show by contacting us on social media.